Well, good afternoon and welcome to the first edition of Scotch Time, Cultured Conversations, that presents rich and diverse voices and inspirational ideas. It gives us all a chance to hear from proven leaders in the in the literary field, engaged in issues that face our communities. It is about speaking softly, elegantly, yet be firm and be heard, probably louder, unlike the shrill media. I remember when the book done by Mr. Kocher, The Untold Story of Indian Reforms, commemorating the 25 years of Indian reforms, it was released. It came endorsed by luminaries from across the spectrum that made us believe that it would either be a very interesting book or it will be a boring book. The book in discussion today, 10 Flashpoints, 20 Years by Mr. Manish Tiwari, also comes endorsed by a wide spectrum of experts. As I come with a PhD in strategic affairs, and I've read the book cover to cover with great interest, and I must say that it is indeed very, very interesting and a lucid narrative and not at all a boring one, although it may have stirred many a hornet's nests. In today's cultured conversations, we are joined by Lady Kishwar Desai, an award-winning author and a playwright whose recent widely acclaimed book, The Longest Case, The Life and Times of Devika Rani, has emerged from a 15-year search and documents and material. She's also credited with setting up world's first partition museum in Amritsar, what we discussed a little while ago. And we have with us Mr. Tiwari, an eminent author, lawyer, and a distinguished parliamentarian with 10 flashpoints, 20 years, in conversation with Lady Desai. Over to you.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. And of course, Manish is someone one has known for a long time, appreciated his work, and the fact that he has always led the way in many different ways. I think even in his parliamentarian career, as a lawyer, and of course, as a proud Punjabi. I really welcome him because I have enjoyed reading his book very, very much. Manish, many congratulations on the book, firstly.
Thank you very much. That's really kind of you. And may I thank you and Samir and everyone else for doing this. It's really very heartwarming.
So I think that because you wear so many hats, it's also interesting for us to know that now you've decided to write this book. What was your journey like as an author, and why did you choose this particular thing? Because this is on national security, this particular subject. It is a subject that I think we have had many debates on, but there's always been more thunder than light whenever people talk on television, whereas yours is a very analytical book. It is a book in which a lot of different areas, which we did not know so much about, actually, you have dwelt upon. And I think it's fascinating for us to see that you have chosen 20 flashpoints, 10 flashpoints in the last 20 years. You could have done possibly many more, and the scope of this book could have been even larger. Can you tell us why you wrote this book, and how did you come to decide that you would like to focus on the last 20 years?
Thank you, Kishwarji. That's a very, very interesting question. This was a book which I was not planning to write. I was actually writing another book called the New Security Doctrine for India. That was the book I was writing. And when I wrote 2 chapters of it, I realized that it was absolutely sterile without context. And the context needed to be provided in terms of at least what has happened over the past 2 decades, to be able to contextualize what I thought or what I think, and which I plan to write now, should be the new security doctrine for India going forth over the next 3 decades. And therefore, I then applied my mind and I thought, let me focus on what were those significant national security challenges that India faced over the past 2 decades. And when I sat down to write the book, I was very cognizant of the fact that in a very polarized environment, as a practicing politician, I was going to comment about events which have led to an extremely acerbic debate in our public space. But then I decided that I would be regime agnostic. I would not look at A government or B government in terms of what was its political orientation, but really try and see how various governments dealt with these challenges over the past 20 years. And this really was the path that I chose. And as you would see that one of the running themes through the book is the fact that India, unfortunately, over the past 7 decades, has not been able to break out of its neighborhood. The unfinished business of partition with Pakistan, extremely unfortunate. The unsettled borders with China, they continue to lock India into South Asia. And so, therefore, even if you look at the past 20 years, the one glaring omission that you will see in the book is that I have not spoken about the Indian Ocean and the maritime challenges. Because primarily, I don't think, except for 26/11, when the terrorists actually came by sea, we've really faced a significant challenge in the maritime domain. All our challenges really, unfortunately, have been on our land borders.
Mm-hmm. Right. No, that's very, very interesting, because obviously this book may have required a lot of research, but because you are a practicing parliamentarian, I'm sure a lot of this information was already on your fingertips. I do have one more question to ask you before we get into the details of the book. And that is that you yourself have a private member's bill, which has been in Parliament now for many years. That is also somewhat to do with intelligence gathering and therefore national security. And we've had a lot of criticism on the operations of our national intelligence agencies. And you could have stood up in Parliament and decided to critique it, as have done many other people. But you decided to try and push forth a bill. Can you tell us a bit more about this?
So, the bill emanated actually in 2009 out of certain questions I'd asked in Parliament with regard to the legal architecture of both our law enforcement and our investigative organizations. And I have always believed that in a democracy, no organization which has the powers to A, deprive people of their life and liberty, and B, to be able to transgress into their private space should function without a proper legislative remit. And in fact, only yesterday we had this debate on the CBI in Parliament and the Enforcement Directorate, because the government has brought certain ordinances which are extremely nepotistic, to say the least. And there also, I flagged the fact that the CBI is perhaps an illegal organization. It's the resolution constituting it has been struck down by the Guwahati High Court in 2013. And unfortunately, the Supreme Court has not found the time in the last 8 years to really adjudicate on its legality. And the same was the problem with the Intelligence Bureau, with the RNNW, with the NTRO. And therefore, we had various rounds of discussions with experts, with people who had served in these organizations. Concurrently, at that point in time, in the IDSA, one of the former officers of the RNNW, Mr. Rana Banerjee, was also doing a roadmap on intelligence reforms. So, drawing sustenance from the work that he was doing, my own consultations, I decided to move this bill. And I was later informed that there was discussion within government with regard to the fact that it could possibly be adopted as a formal bill, because if you look at the MI5, MI6, the CIA, or the intelligence agencies in Germany, Japan, even Russia for that matter, they all are grounded in a legislative framework. They have an overarching parliamentary oversight mechanism. But then I moved to government and the bill lapsed. And after that, this government has a completely different orientation towards what they consider should be the approach towards national security. And though I've tabled the bill once again, as of last Friday, I moved the bill again in Parliament. But as you know, private members' bills are not really, don't really go through. We've had only one or two go through, but I'm hopeful, even if it's flagged for discussion in Parliament and we have a full-fledged discussion on it, at some point in time, this is a much needed reform, which should see the light of the day.
That we can hope for, because as you said, a very provocative statement there saying that the CBI may be an illegal organization. I think the question of intelligence gathering is very deeply linked to national security. And very often it is a failure of intelligence that has led to these flashpoints that you have documented so ably in your book. What brings me to the fact, the next question again is also somewhat linked to current happenings right now. We very recently lost the Chief of Defense Staff. And when I was reading your book, I saw so many references to the fact that you yourself have been advocating a series of reforms, and you yourself have been talking about in your book and otherwise about the fact that the Indian Army also needed to have certain reforms take place. Firstly, of course, we do offer our condolences to the family of the CDS, and of course, the whole country is in mourning right now. But what was your opinion on the CDS? And did you feel that this was a much needed reform that took place, or are you critical about it?
Well, you're absolutely right. What happened with General Rawat and his wife and the 11 other people who were on board that plane is extremely, extremely unfortunate. And I think everybody is one with their families in trying to share their grief and trying to mitigate their grief. And when such an unfortunate incident takes place, it just reminds you as to how much we take for granted, how actually how precarious is human life. 1 second you are there and the other second you are gone. Well, as you are aware that the Kargil Review Committee and the group of ministers, which of course was very critical, the Kargil Review Committee headed by Dr. Jaishankar's father, Dr. Subramanian, was very, very critical about the intelligence failure during Kargil. And out of the slew of reforms which they recommended, one, of course, was the creation of the Chief of Defense Staff. Now, that was a reform which did not get implemented from 2001 till 2019, when Prime Minister Modi decided to create the position of the Chief of Defense Staff. It left a number of questions unanswered, primarily because it takes a while for an institution like this to settle down. For example, if the CDS would be the single point military advisor to the government, would the government be then bereft of the views of the other service chiefs? And would that really bring a fullness of or a complete spectrum of views and opinions to bear on national security decision making? Number two, of course, was the whole question that the Department of Military Affairs, which was going to be headed by the CDS, ultimately, how does it really impact on the civil-military relationship within the MOD? Because as you are aware that the defense forces are not really integrated into the Ministry of Defense in India. They are attached officers of the Ministry of Defense. Of course, there's been a long-standing demand for this integration. And under those circumstances where exactly, or how exactly would this play out in terms of the whole civil military dynamic. Third, of course, was the very ambitious attempt which late General Rawat was making with regard to the reorganization of the Indian armed forces into theater commands. And in fact, some of the other former chiefs of the Air Force and the Navy had publicly voiced their, I wouldn't say misgivings, but their apprehensions about the trajectory of this entire exercise. And I'm informed by one of my parliamentary colleagues that apparently when this matter came up in the Standing Committee of Defense, they did suggest to General Rawat that this entire exercise of reorganizing the armed forces should also be brought to the attention of the Standing Committee of Defense. So to answer your question in brief, I mean, it's just been 2 years since the position was created. And so therefore, it takes a while for something of this import to really settle down. And it's tragic that within 2 years, we'll have a new CDS. But I guess that's the nature of life. And so once the new CDS takes over, we'll have to wait and see as to whether he takes those reforms forward or he has his own views with regard to how he would like to do things. But yes, this was a prickly reform. And Prime Minister Modi, to his credit, actually bit the bullet and did go ahead and create the position of the Chief of Defense Staff. There were differing views across different administrations. Prime Minister Vajpayee also, the fact that he did not accept this particular recommendation or action this particular recommendation, I think reflected a certain amount of hesitation, and it stayed that way during Prime Minister Dr. Manmohan Singh's time. And so therefore, there we are, and we have a CDS now, and we'll have to wait for this institution to evolve.
Right. Another area where your book is extremely topical is that we are now approaching, I think it is the 20th anniversary of the attack on Parliament, if I'm not mistaken, on the 13th of December. Now, a lot of questions were raised even about that. Was there really such an intelligence failure? People, in fact, did not even believe that this was a real attack for some time, which could have been engineered by forces across the border, etc. So there was a lot of controversy about what happened then. Your book, I think, in a sense, is refreshing because some of the questions which have been raised and which have been troubling many of us, be it the Batla encounter, be it of course, the reaction to 26/11, etc. I think you have not pulled any punches in trying to be perfectly balanced. You were in Delhi at the time of the attack on Parliament. You have described it very well in your book. Could you share that experience with us? And what was your biggest takeaway from that? Because that is really serious. And as you said, it was preceded by another attack on the J&K Parliament as well. So could you recount your recollections, and what did you think were the lessons from there?
Well, thank you very much for that question. Post the Kargil War and India's victory in the Kargil War, well, some people say that it was not a war, but a limited border war. But whatever nomenclature one would like to ascribe to it, the fact was that we were able to repel the intruders, we were able to reclaim our territory. But post that, India enters into a very, very nasty phase of the proxy war, which Pakistan has now been waging, going all the way back to 1975 or 77, if I was to put a timestamp onto it, post their humiliation in Bangladesh. So therefore, you had the IC-814 hijack, then you had the Jammu and Kashmir assembly attack, and then you had the attack on Indian Parliament. And unfortunately, I was just 100 meters away when the attack was unfolding. because I was on my way from, I think, somewhere in Chittaranjan Park to meet one of my predecessors as the president of the Indian Youth Congress, Mr. Bitta, who just stays very close to Parliament and still continues to stay there. And I had barely entered his house when his NSG guards went on a complete red alert and informed us that there was an attack unfolding in Parliament. And of course, Mr. Bitta, being the brave man that he is, actually took out his personal weapon and went out onto his lawn, wanting to go out. He was, of course, restrained by his guards. Unfortunately, as you're aware, he was targeted in two bomb blasts, one in Amritsar and then the other one at the Indian Youth Congress headquarters in 1993. And providentially, he was able to escape, from both of them. And so we actually watched the whole attack unfold on live television. And obviously, the thought was that how could this have happened? How could, when you're dealing with non-state actors, they do have the advantage of surprise. And so therefore, the security forces have to be alert all the time, while these people just need to get lucky once. But still, an attack on the Parliament of India. Unfortunately, the watch and ward staff was alert. They were able to foil these people from getting in. And God forbid if they would have actually got into Parliament, and you would have had, a couple of ministers or parliamentarians becoming victims. The whole dynamic of the subcontinent would have taken a completely different turn altogether. I mean, this was the ultimate provocation. And Prime Minister Vajpayee did action Operation Parakram after that, the largest mobilization of the Indian Armed Forces since 1971. Unfortunately, it had no clearly defined objectives. In fact, I've quoted an article of General Panag, where he writes that the then Navy chief asked the CCS that what are the war objectives? And he was ostensibly told that mobilize first, and then you will have, we'll give you clarity on that. And then you had the unfortunate incident where Lieutenant General Kapil Vij, who was the Second Strike Force commander, was replaced while his tanks had moved closer to the border than possibly is the informal understanding between the two armies. But that sent out a signal to Pakistan, that replacement, which ostensibly happened because American satellites had picked up the movement of the armored assets, that we were not serious about pushing the envelope. And so in many senses of the word, Operation Parakram really blunted the sword arm of India's coercive diplomacy, because you had such a huge mobilization, and at the end of it, there was nothing really to show for it. And then, interestingly, right after Operation Parakram, Prime Minister Vajpayee's Pakistan policy actually takes a complete U-turn. So Parakram ends in the November of 2002, and in the April of 2003, Prime Minister Vajpayee, who was the author of Aar Paar Ki Ladai after the Kaluchuk massacre, while this mobilization was going on, which many people describe as the second peak of the Parliament crisis, then takes a complete U-turn and then says ki Insaniyat, Jamhuriyat, Kashmiriyat, and concurrent outreach to Pakistan. So, to my mind, when I look at it, this inconsistency, and I'm not making a value judgment on Prime Minister Vajpayee or his national security team, but this inconsistency in our approach, whereby we embark on a particular path and then end up doing a complete U-turn, does not really inspire confidence in our ability to be able to to act according to our best strategic interests, if I was to put it in that manner.
Fascinating. So are you saying that under BJP, under Congress, for a long time, India was considered a soft state? That's one part of my question, since you've talked about flashpoints, and those flashpoints, as we have seen in your book, occur with alarming regularity. And the other question is, which you have already mentioned in this answer of yours, is that American satellites were always picking up what was happening in India. And you have also said that there was probably some behind the scenes American intervention. Was that one of the reasons that India remained a soft state for so long?
Well, see, I would not like to put that tag or label on any country, least of all India, that we are a soft state in terms of our national security. I think there are certain quintessential dilemmas that we have, and those dilemmas have not been resolved. And that dilemma is, and this goes back all the way to possibly 1980, when the first phase of the proxy war really starts in Punjab, that should you use conventional force against non-state actors? Number two, if you use conventional force, then how do you calibrate it? Number three, if, let us suppose, the use of that kinetic force leads to an escalatory spiral, are there any off-ramps to de-escalate? Number four, is there space for even a limited war under a nuclear overhang? Number five, the ethical dilemma that should a state which is being subjected to attacks by semi-state actors or non-state actors, or is being subject to a proxy war, should it resort to the same means in order to combat it? I think those dilemmas today, even today, 30 years later, 40 years later, still remain equally unresolved. Prime Minister Modi did take a forward-leaning position with regard to Uri, right? So you had public ownership of these surgical strikes, which, as I've documented, have been going on since 1998. And then you had the Balakot bombings. Now, the question is that, did it really bring about a behavior change in the deep state of Pakistan? And the empirical evidence is no, because if it would have brought about a behavior change, then Pulwama wouldn't have succeeded Uri. The attack in Pulwama, with the Jaish publicly taking ownership of it, wouldn't really have happened. And so therefore, we've tried different approaches. We've tried strategic restraint for over all these years. We've tried tactical aggression with what Prime Minister Modi did in Uri or later in Balakot. But to my mind, neither seems to have worked. And so therefore, Pakistan, being the quasi-military state that it is, it's a hard state, it's a quasi-military state, we really need to think these things through. We can all pat ourselves on the back at election rallies saying that, we sent our Air Force jets across the international border or line of control, or, we made a shallow incursion 700 meters to 3 kilometers deep, as in the case of Uri. But the fundamental question, has something changed in Pakistan as a consequence of this? And the answer is a no. And so therefore, what you require is a dispassionate debate on national security. Right? And I have seen that dispassionate debate occurring when practitioners meet in various track 1.5s and 2s. When you actually see practitioners of national security talking, the debate is very objective. Unfortunately, when the politicians get involved in the public space, it becomes completely polarized. And that's what we need to avoid as a country, because ultimately, any decision which has national security implications is always a political decision.
Right. Well, interesting coming from a politician. You say when politicians get involved, the debate gets polarized. But Manish, I do want to say that your book, again, I want to reiterate, is very balanced because you take on the events of 2611. You're very critical about the way it was handled. It was your party's government. And of course, there has been a lot of debate already about this. But I want to ask you that, do you think that, of course, it was a failure, enormous failure of intelligence even at that time, but do you think it could have been handled any differently? And could the outcome of that, because, all of us, I wouldn't say both of us, but definitely most of us would not like to see a war, a full-fledged war with Pakistan. But at that time, what options were there? And had we, I mean, if you just do a contrafactual and you say that had we gone to war, what would have been the outcome? What are your thoughts on that?
First of all, I I have never advocated war in the book. Even in the context of 2611, I have never advocated war because I do not believe war is really in anybody's interest. In fact, to complete the answer to the last question, when I talked about different governments adopting different postures vis-a-vis Pakistan, the one thing which comes out of this book is also the fact that possibly we need to explore or energize ways to find a political solution to both Pakistan and China. And I do point out that the Manmohan Musharraf formula, which of course the Pakistanis now publicly disavow, or at least official Pakistan disavows, was our best chance. And we missed that bus in 2007, because the Indian state deterred, thinking that after Lal Masjid and the lawyers' protest, President Musharraf didn't have the political capital to be able to sell it. Was it to go through? In my estimation, whether we like it or not, since Kashmir remains the core issue for Pakistan, and Kashmir and its territorial integrity is sacrosanct for India, the only real solution is to make borders irrelevant. So whether you would like to call it a Dr. Manmohan Singh, President Musharraf formula, or give it some other name, at some point in time, you will have to go back to it. That is really the only prudent way forward. And interestingly, 2611 comes 2 months after Musharraf demits office. So is there a linkage between President Musharraf demitting office and 2611 getting action by the Pakistani deep state? Because obviously an operation of this magnitude could not have been planned and executed in a mere 2 months. And so obviously it would have been in the works longer. And as I think the trial of Ajmal Kasab and whatever information has come from David Coleman Hadley point out, that the reconnaissance for this attack and its planning had been going on for a long time. And so to answer your question, I do strongly feel, and of course, even Mr. Shiv Shankar Menon in his book Choices alludes to the fact that, there was a view, even in government, that there should have been some kind of a kinetic response. Maybe terror camps being targeted, or a price or a cost imposed on those who were the masterminds of this particular very, very ghastly and macabre cold-blooded slaughter. And when I think back about on it, I do strongly feel that yes, intelligence failure, whether it is Kargil or 2611 or the Chinese transgressions, seems to be a running problem with us as a state. But given the scale and the magnitude of what had happened, I think that a retaliatory response should have happened.
Right. Well, then that, as you said, the only two retaliatory responses which have been tried in the past, which have failed, of course, and then we can go forward from there and think of something else. One is, of course, sanctions, like you mentioned, which have not been very successful in the past, and or surgical strikes, which might have been made public. If they took place, we don't know, but obviously in your reckoning there was no such thing. But what I found also very interesting, Manish, when you described that chapter, is your own dilemma as a spokesperson for the Congress, facing this battery of questions from journalists, and honestly, nobody really had an answer. No one had a clue what was going on at that time, except that the media was all over the place, which also is now being questioned, whether they should have been allowed such fair, I wouldn't say fair, but free access. You had actually appreciated that in Kargil, during the time of Kargil, but you seem to be a bit more critical about the fact that the media was allowed this access at the time of 26/11.
So to answer that question, and that's a very, very legitimate question that you raise. You see, in the case of Kargil, the kind of access that the media had allowed it to contextualize and put things in the right perspective. Since they were reporting from the front lines, if you were to use a latter day term, they were embedded with the troops. So therefore, they were able to send back information which was which allowed the country to get a sense of what is happening on the border. But 26/11 and the media coverage was ghastly. You had television channels falling over each other, competing for TRPs, milking India's greatest tragedy. I still remember those slugs, which used to appear on television screen, breaking news, first on this television, first on that television. And the fact that it was an unfolding operation, and the second day, it became apparent that it was being remote controlled by the handlers from Pakistan. And so therefore, if the handlers would have deployed maybe 10 spotters, they wouldn't have given such accurate information. You had 400 odd television channels swarming all over the place, actually trying to second guess the whole operation. So in terms of what played out during 26/11, in terms of how the media really went completely over the top, was unprecedented. And frankly, if I would have been the information and broadcasting minister at that point in time, a large number of these media houses would have lost their licenses. I mean, I do feel very, very, very strongly that, if there were SOPs, those SOPs were not followed. And I subsequently, since I then later on headed that ministry, I was informed that it was only post 26/11 that some SOPs as to how terror incidents have to be covered. The fact that there has to be a deferred live, at least 1 hour or more of deferred time coverage needs to be done. So therefore, that was, that was completely and absolutely ghastly. In terms of information, yes, obviously, since it was an evolving situation, nobody really had a clue about how this is going to end. And since I had the onerous task of actually briefing the media in the middle of that operation, it was definitely a tough act, because they had all the questions to ask. And obviously, government did not want to speak, because any authoritative statement by a government minister could have been taken out of context, even subsequently. So, government rightly wanted to keep away. For example, when I became Minister for Information and Broadcasting, I stepped down as the national spokesperson of the Congress Party, because you can't wear these two hats, as the spokesperson of a political party and also the spokesperson of the government and the cabinet. I mean, these two roles are completely and absolutely of a different order altogether. And so I completely agreed when I was told that, they would not want to field a ministerial colleague of ours who was a spokesperson with us, and would rather have me brief. I think that was a fair call which was taken. But when I look back on those days, uh, I still do very strongly feel, or maybe it's because of my own personal brush with terror, that we should have imposed a cost on them. The fact that the perpetrators of 26/11 have actually walked free, uh, literally walked free, except for some FATF processes which are still playing themselves out. There is really, really nothing at all. And I think nobody should be allowed to walk away scot-free after slaughtering 166 people in cold blood.
Absolutely. And I think you mentioned personal brush with terror. And I think that also you have written about it, though quite briefly in your book, is about how your father was shot dead by terrorists. So I think your interest possibly in the whole, intelligence failures and about national security might just stem from that. Few people know about this, Manish. Would you like to tell us a little bit about how your father was killed?
Well, my interest actually, Kishwarji, really stemmed from the fact that I cut my political teeth in the front lines of the battle against extremism and separatism in Punjab in the early 80s. So therefore, I was in the National Students Union of India. We were fighting the All India Sikh Students Federation and other fisciporous tendencies at that point in time. And of course, my father, who was a professor of comparative modern Indian literature, was a nominated member of the Rajya Sabha, was a great exponent of the ideological fight against separatism and extremism. In fact, he was the person who had really coined this phrase Punjab, Punjabi, and Punjabiyat. So therefore, the composite culture of Punjab, the synthesis of Hindus and Sikhs living together post 1947. I mean, that was his entire swan song, and that was borne out by the fact that despite Punjab being subjected to 15 years of vicissitudes from across the border, there was never ever a Hindu Sikh riot in Punjab. So therefore, those bonds are so strong. And what we say in Punjabi, ki no maas da saath hai. And those were actually the bonds which Pakistan and their proxies were trying to break. So in his case, it was a mixture of things. Number one, of course, he had organized the World Punjabi Writers Conference in the December of 1983 in New Delhi, which Mrs. Gandhi, President Zail Singh had inaugurated and presided over respectively to basically condemn. So he had gathered all the Punjabi writers from all over the world, to condemn this strain of separatism and extremism which was playing itself out. And then he was, one of the tracks with regard to the negotiations which were going on with the Akalis on one hand, Sant Harchand Singh Longowal and Gurcharan Singh Toda, and with Sant Bhindranwale on the other. So there were different things at play, and my own sense of it is that we were or they were very close to a breakthrough at that point in time. They were actually down to the nitty-gritty of it as to how do we sequence it, the very simple things which would have brought about a resolution. Declaring Amritsar as a holy city, Gurbani being played from on All India Radio, and there were 3-4 other things. And my sense is that the terrorists, when they came, they basically wanted him out of the way since he was the interlocutor. So they came one morning dressed as, masquerading as his students, and of course we had no security at that point in time. So our maid opened the door. So they said they are students. They've come to see him. She took them to the drawing room. I think it was about 6 a.m. And so he came to the drawing room, and as he entered, so one of these guys, he bent down to touch his feet. and he pulled out a pistol from somewhere close to his ankle, and he shot him 9 times in the stomach. And so, hearing those bullet sounds, my mother, who's also a doctor, she kind of rushed out to and tried to protect him. So this guy, he kind of threw her off and took a shot at her. Fortunately for her, he had run out of bullets, so he had pumped all those 9 or 11 bullets which were there in the magazine into my dad. And yeah, so therefore we then picked him up, took him to the hospital. Since all the doctors used to live around where we were staying, so I collected all the doctors and took them, but the damage was just too much, in the sense there was a lot of internal bleeding, and he eventually then had one cardiac arrest, a second cardiac arrest, and he died on the operation table.
So you were there throughout this. I mean, you were there.
I was there. So we were in our bedroom upstairs. I mean, my sister and I, who was younger to me, and so when I heard the sound, I thought maybe a gas cylinder or something had exploded. So nobody, I mean, it was 6 a.m. By the time I rushed down, these guys had already exited. It barely. I think the whole thing lasted barely about 2 or 3 minutes. So, I mean, by the time I was able to come down the stairs, and obviously I would have rushed immediately hearing all these sounds, they were gone. And on the way, I think they stopped to change the number plates of their car, and there was some bystander or somebody out for a morning walk who saw them. So they shot him in cold blood. And those were actually very difficult times in Punjab, and as a Punjabi, I always feel that God forbid if we ever have to go back to that very horrendous phase in our history.
Yeah. So obviously, I mean, it must have left a huge impact on you. In many ways, that was the point that I was trying to make, that these kind of horrific incidents and really tragic incident in your own life could have somewhere triggered your own interest in national security, and also the whole fact that India has had a long history of terrorism is something very close to your heart. The problem which started, of course, in Punjab, which you've said very succinctly, was, bleeding India with 1,000 cuts. I think then continued in Kashmir for a very long time. And those of us who remember Punjab as a very peaceful state, Kashmir as a very, very peaceful place where I've lived there for many years, and my father was posted there. And it is unbelievable. It is absolutely unbelievable sometimes, I feel, to think what has happened with it. Manish, a lot of us were very hopeful with the new policy. I have to say this because we felt that once there was a physical integration of Kashmir, Jammu and Kashmir, into the Constitution of India, this would, under the Constitution of India, by the revocation of Article 370, something might just be, there might just be a sea change in the environment. I still remain hopeful. Maybe I'm always an optimistic. You obviously are not. Your views are much more pessimistic. Would you like to share those?
Well, as I have explained in the book, I think the fundamental mistake got made in 1953, as P.N. Haksar wrote in a letter to Mrs. Gandhi, which I think Jairam reproduced in his own book, that the arrest of Sheikh Abdullah and what followed subsequently. I think inadvertently the Indian state made a fundamental decision that we want the territory and not the people. And from 1953 onwards, if you look at it, in varying shades and hues, you've seen the specter of alienation, of isolation, becoming all the more pronounced. Jammu and Kashmir was the only state which was allowed the privilege of having its own constitution. They had a constituent assembly. The constituent assembly crafted a constitution which was promulgated, which was adopted and then promulgated. And then, of course, you had this whole Article 370 paradigm concurrently, flowing from the Delhi Declaration of 1952. And then you've had the hollowing out of 370 over the years. But the manner in which it was abrogated, and since I am counsel for one of the petitioners before the Supreme Court, in my respectful opinion, was completely and absolutely an unconstitutional way of doing it. I was the lead speaker from the opposition benches opposing the abrogation of Article 370 and the dismemberment of Jammu and Kashmir into two union territories, an unprecedented first in the history of India. And the reason why I say that the move with regard to Article 370 was unconstitutional is because if you say that the successor of the Constituent Assembly cannot merely be proscribed because Article 371D said that without the concurrence of the Constituent Assembly, it cannot be done. I can understand that argument to some extent, that the logical successor would have been the Legislative Assembly of Jammu and Kashmir. But the Jammu and Kashmir Assembly was not in session at that point in time. The state was under president's rule. So therefore, you substituted the Constituent Assembly for the Legislative Assembly of Jammu and Kashmir. And since Parliament, since the state was under president's rule, Parliament effectively became the Legislative Assembly of Jammu and Kashmir. And so therefore, Parliament consulted with itself and went ahead and abrogated Article 370. In my respectful estimation, that's completely unconstitutional. And, since the matter will play itself out in the court, let's see what the court decides. But the broader point, that has it really integrated the people of Jammu and Kashmir, or has it increased the feeling of alienation? And I think the latter is more correct. Kashmir has been simmering for a very long time. And I think the simmer has only got exacerbated since 2019. I do hope it is not a tinder box waiting for the proverbial spark. But in my estimation, we have to walk that extra mile to ensure that we integrate the people of Jammu and Kashmir with us, especially the Kashmir Valley. We need to make that emotional outreach. That has been completely missing in the past 7.5 years. And eventually, you've also studied the history of conflicts. No conflict resolves itself till the time you do not get the people on board. And the Indian state has experience with that. We resolved Assam, we resolved Mizoram. I mean, these were political resolutions. Punjab also may have got resolved if Sant Harchand Singh Longowal wouldn't have got assassinated. Post the Punjab Accord in 1985, we had the Naga peace negotiations playing themselves out, which unfortunately have received a setback because of the incident which took place, which so many innocent people have lost their lives. Again, a very unfortunate incident. And so in the case of Jammu and Kashmir, you see, if you go back to 1990, a child born in 1990 in Kashmir would today be 21 years old, right? 1990, 2000, 31 years old. In the past 3 decades, he's only seen violence as a normal. It's something equivalent to, what happened to a whole generation in Afghanistan post 1979. So therefore, when the only normal you've seen is violence and terror and cordon and search operations and extrajudicial disappearances, you are dealing with an extremely traumatized generation and a half or two. And in my respectful estimation, till the time we are not able to resolve and surmount that, and have an emotional outreach, we will not be, if we think, uh, resolve Kashmir through a law and order situation solution. I don't think there's a law and order solution to it. I mean, you look at the case of Ireland. Ultimately, it was a political accord which brought about peace to Northern Ireland, and I think that's the way to go.
Right. Well, some would argue, Manish, that it's not really, a peaceful accord inside India, but it is rather an accord with Pakistan that will ultimately bring peace to Kashmir, because till Pakistan has this grudge, and as you yourself point out in your book, that it was going to be their agenda, and it has been, according to many experts, for ever since the Bangladesh, ever since the creation of Bangladesh and India's role in it. So it is something which they are seeking to take revenge. This is what your book also states, and others as well. So one would argue that, the Indian state can do whatever it can do to win hearts and minds. But until we have a peaceful neighborhood, which you yourself have said, you cannot choose your neighbors, but you have to live with them. You have to keep on renegotiating with them. We do not have too much time left. In fact, we are almost out of time. But I did want to discuss the whole China transgression problem with you, which I know is extremely worrying these days for many people. And especially, as you have mentioned in your book, we do not actually know the extent of this transgression, and we do not know much about it. Do you want to quickly comment before we close this session?
So to answer your question on Pakistan, you're absolutely correct. Kashmir is a psychological problem with Pakistan going back all the way to 1947. Unfortunately, it's got compounded by that institutional sense of humiliation that they feel after the Bangladesh defeat. And Prime Minister Vajpayee, I guess, figured that out, when he extended the olive branch of Jamhuriyat Insaniyat, Kashmiriyat Insaniyat Jamhuriyat to the people of Jammu and Kashmir, and made a concurrent outreach to Pakistan, right? So therefore, you are absolutely correct. I mean, Pakistan is unfortunately the third leg of this stride, whether we like it or not. But we leave that for another day. In the case of China, I think we've still not figured out why did the Chinese do what they have done. Even 19 months later, I don't think that there is a clear understanding within the Indian state that why did the Chinese do what they have done. Was it that the Chinese got provoked by some bellicose statements made in parliament with regard to a sky China? I don't think that the Chinese would actually undertake any kind of a tactical transgression based upon certain statements which may have been made in parliament during the course of the debate on Jammu and Kashmir. Was it because of the infrastructure that we were constructing, along the line of actual control, the DBSO road? I don't think so, because it had been in the works for a while. Or was it that they needed a post-COVID diversion? So if you really look at it, between the January and the April of 2020, China was under attack from across the world. That you guys were economical with information about what was happening in Wuhan, and look at the kind of catastrophe that it has unleashed. So the Chinese actually did three things. They did the transgressions across the line of actual control. They actually announced 2 administrative districts in the South China Sea, which was extremely provocative. You were really impinging upon competing claims which all the littoral states of the South China Sea have. And number 3, they moved on the sovereignty of Hong Kong, by enacting that new security law. So were the Chinese actually trying to send out a message that if you box us in, we are going to come out swinging? And was that the reason why these Chinese transgressions happen? Or is it that the rise of Xi Jinping has inaugurated a completely new chapter in the way China would now want to conduct itself on the world stage? And then what really are the implications of that for neighbors like India? Or was it because we decided to oppose the Belt and Road Initiative, we didn't show up for the BRI conference in 2018? So I think we still, unfortunately, don't have a read on the Chinese intentions. What we are dealing with is their attempt to change facts on the ground. But why did they embark on this course? Because after all, going back to 1975, the Sino-Indian border had been absolutely peaceful. I mean, the last incident takes place in 1975 when the Chinese unfortunately killed some Assam Rifle Jawans. And since 75, it had been a peaceful trajectory going across many dispensations. Yes, there were differences. They were trying to resolve themselves. And even today, as we are in the worst standoff with China, our trade with China continues to increase. I think China, even today, is India's #1 trading partner. So therefore, you have this interesting contradiction that while you are deployed on the border and you are literally being bled white because of that deployment, on the other hand, you have the Sino-Indian trade, touching almost an unprecedented high. I mean, it went down in 2020 because of certain decisions the government had taken, but I think it's back to the 2019 levels already. So how do you then deal with this? What is going on? And in my estimation, within the Indian state, within the Indian academia, there isn't enough institutional knowledge on China. For example, how many Mandarin speakers do we really have? So there is a need to build institutional capacity, to have institutes both within and outside government, which study China very closely, not only in strategic terms, but, in political terms, in cultural terms, and, in economic terms, a full spectrum understanding of their leadership, of China as a nation, and what its trajectory would be, given the fact that it is also going to be coming to the end of its demographic dividend, are things that we as a neighbor should need to study very carefully. China is very peripheral to our entire disposition as a country. We possibly know more about the UK or the US, which doesn't threaten us. But China, I'm afraid, I don't see that institutional knowledge at all.
Well, so that gives us a sense that this might be your next book then, Manish, which could be about the India-China paradox. But I do want to thank you for this very enlightening session and for have written this book, which I found absolutely unputdownable. And I would highly recommend it to everybody who's listening in, that you must read it. It gives you a sense of what is happening in India today as far as national security issues are concerned. Thank you so much. I'll hand it back to our wonderful hosts.
Well, thank you so much, Kishwarji, for steering it so well. And in fact, when you read the book is a text and which sans emotion. So Manishji, very succinctly, you have put the context to the text, and it has become even more interesting. The pages that I sifted through, and now I could relate with that as to what exactly was the thought process behind the book, and it's very, very interesting. So thank you to both of you for making this discussion so lively. And I'm sure this will be a great addition to our Scotch Time Cultured Conversations, because we have been able to draw the point home as to what are the answers that in a democracy are required. And these are put together in a form and a fashion which actually becomes a document to refer to. Well, thank you all once again for being with us. And
thank you very much. And thank you for hosting this. My thanks to Kishwarjit, my thanks to Samir, my thanks to our moderator. Thank you very much for doing this. I'm really honored and touched. Thank you very much.
Thank you.